it is not obvious or intuitive how that works, this exploitation of comparative advantage. But if you think about it, what makes sense is Abedin, here Tom, is less productive in absolute terms, but the lowest cost producer of fish. Because remember, one fish cost Tom 1 apple, but one fish cost Abedin 2 apples. His ratio of substitution was different between the two. And so, by specializing in a comparative advantage, Tom allows Abedin to exploit his comparative advantage. 1 apple costs him 1/2 of a fish. Remember, he can have 200 fish. He gives up 1 apple. It costs 1 whole fish to Tom. Right? The ratio here, 1 to 1, 1 to 2. So simply allowing people to engage in comparative advantage, exploiting their comparative advantage, allows them to produce a larger total outcome. Now, this was initially developed in economics to explain international trade. And David Ricardo wanted to explain, and his famous example was port wine from Portugal, because they don't produce wine in England. It's like this all the time outside, and grapes don't like this kind of weather very much. So England is not very good for growing grapes and making wine. Portugal is. But then they exported English wool. This weather is very good for sheep. When I say this weather, I mean wet, and not hot like this. But cold, wet weather, which is England, the sheep get really hairy because they're cold all the time. So when you cut it off, you get a lot of wool. So the English are able to produce a lot of wool, and in order to do that, they're not giving up very much wine, because they cannot produce very much wine in England. The opposite goes for Portugal. Right? Portugal tends relatively dry and hot, so the sheep are skinny and don't have much hair. But the grapes are full and wonderful, so they can make wine and exchange it for the fleece and the wool from England. So usually people think about this in the context of international trade, but it is actually much broader in its significance than merely international trade. It's about all trade. It's about trade inside countries, within neighborhoods, even inside families. Children will engage in cooperative behavior that is based on the same basic principle, that they'll exchange and trade in order to increase the total aggregate outcome, so that each participant gets a bigger piece of the total outcome. Now you might say, well, why is this so important? And the most fundamental reason is, if this were not true, if it were not the case that people could engage in such productive specialization and mutually advantageous trade, civilization would be impossible. Some social theorists have argued that civilization and society is founded on love. I think that's wrong. Economists will tell you it's fundamentally mistaken. Love is not the foundation of civilization. Love is the product of civilization, the outcome. Because if it were the case that what is good for Ling is bad for Tom, Tom and Ling could not be friends. But because we can engage in mutually advantageous cooperation, so what's good for Ling is also good for Tom, that makes it possible for Tom and Ling to be friends. It makes it possible for the higher human capacities of friendship, of love, of honor, of solidarity to emerge. They're the fruit of civilization, but not the root, if you will. The root of civilization is this simple fact that human beings can engage in mutually beneficial cooperation, such that all of them benefit from it. And the fruit of that then is all of the higher sympathies of friendship and solidarity, concern, charity, and so on. My gosh, that's quite an astonishing storm out there. So we can then ask an additional set of questions then, and I'll pose these primarily as questions for us to discuss. If the outcome of a system of exchanges is a reallocation of resources, so we start out with our property in our own persons, our rights to ourselves. We then have property rights in other things, in land, houses, sheep, various products, natural and otherwise. If we have well-defined, defendable and divestible rights, and then we freely exchange, is the outcome just? In other words, if I in fact have a right to this, and Vian has a right to his the box in front of him, and we exchange, and we're both better off, is the outcome also just? Right? No principles of law were violated, no rights were violated, we exercised our rights, but it may yield a pattern that no one would have predicted. That the allocation of rights that results from that would be such that no one would have predicted it at the outcome. Is the allocation just if the starting point and all of the steps were just? We could also think about some of the present inequalities that we see around us in the world and ask, are those the outcome of the market or a lack of respect for the market, a lack of respect for property rights? That is to say, theft, abuse of power, corruption. I remember in one case, one of the presidents of Mexico, the Mexican president serves for 6 years in his one term that cannot be repeated, which I think probably is one of Mexico's problems. You get into office, you have 6 years to steal as much as you possibly can. And for a long time that's what they've done. Fortunately, Mexico is getting much, much better now. They're really on the right track in my opinion. But for a long time they had astonishing kleptocracy. The president earned about $200,000 US a year, which is, quite high salary. One famous Mexican president retired, and his personal net worth was estimated as over $600 million, based on looting, basically. The way even just in Mexico that it works, the police down here, your average policeman, we were having a conversation about this earlier, demands money from you. When he stops you in the street, money. And again, it is getting better now. I want to be very clear. Mexico is improving. But whenever you went to Mexico, if a Mexican policeman came to you, you know why. They're going to ask for money, right? Well, he was required to send some of that money up. He didn't get to keep it all. He was going to be punished severely by the police captain. The police captain got a share. The police captain had to give a share to the major, all the way up basically to the president of the country. The whole system was a vast system of stealing, if you will. So that's one way to generate a lot of wealth. Or like in the Philippines, the mining activities of the Marcos family, going around, whatever attracted their attention suddenly it belonged to them. Another option would be the super rich in Russia. We have a pretty good sense, not all of them, but many of them, how they became rich was looting state institutions. Or as it happens now, if you do set up a new business, it attracts attention. You get a call from what are called the Siloviki, which means the powerful people. And they explain to you, they say, it's a very nice company, very nice assets you have, get out. So I'm sorry, what do you mean? They say, we're going to make an offer. We value this at about $300 million. We'll give you 50 million and your life. Get out. You say 50 million, life. Okay. I'll get out. And then it belongs to someone else. So when we see inequalities, we always want to ask, how did this inequality emerge? Was it because someone was really good at producing goods and services? I'll give you an example of a very wealthy family.